It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Charlie Gilkey, and we're going to be discussing his book, Start Finishing, How to Go From Idea to Done. Charlie, welcome to the show, man.
Shaun, thanks so much for having me. I am pumped to be here.
Well, I've had enough caffeine to kill a small animal at this point in my day, so I'm going to bring my energy. I hope it's going to be infectious and help you to bring yours. With every interview, I like to start the conversation off with a bit of the author's origin story. So would love to have you kind of take us into a bit of your background and then maybe relate that to how that fits into the content we're going to encounter in your book. Because what was intriguing to me as I looked through all the quality press materials you guys sent over is, you mentioned that you grew up as a black kid poor in the South. You talk about you have a background in the military. You have a background in philosophy. And I'm just like, man, this guy's kind of an enigma. So I'd be curious to hear how all of that sort of fits together into your journey. And then how does that inform where you go in the book? Because you're a very unique character, maybe a unique case study, if you will.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So I guess the easiest place to start is around the time that I started what became Productive Flourishing. So I had recently come back from being deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so I was an Army logistics officer. And I had come back and I was completing my PhD in philosophy. And so I'm a social philosopher and an ethicist. And, it seems super sophomoric to say this now, but at the time I was like, I'm just not able to pull it all together. I'm not getting enough done, right? I have, these things going on here. And what I found is that, so I started doing the research and I noticed that the ends of the spectrum that you just mentioned, sort of the productivity end was super granular, super sort of next action and, at the sort of weekly level and below. And the personal development literature tended to be life vision and principles and values. And my problem was this middle messy world of projects. Like it wasn't that my weeks, my weeks didn't always necessarily align with my true priorities, but there were just a lot of projects that I wasn't able to get done. And it was really stumping me because here I was able to move battalions of troops and equipment throughout the entire Iraq theater, but this 5,000 word essay was kicking my butt. Like it didn't make sense. Like, why am I able to do that and not do this? And part of what I realized is, especially for the creative class, there wasn't someone that actually sat down and taught us how to do it, right? The reason I was able to move battalions is because taxpayer dollars and training paid for me to learn how to do that. And so I started doing a lot of the synthesis and sort of combination of what I was reading to really address this problem. And that became Productive Flourishing, which is where my broader canon of work exists. And to your point about where I grew up in Arkansas. I am Black, multiracial. And so I come from a military family. And so sort of that military side of things has always been part of the blood. And if you're not from a military family, you have to understand people are like, oh, you just felt guilted into doing it. It's like, not so much. It's just who you are. It's what your family does. And so that's how I ended up going to West Point, deciding that's not for me and getting my civilian education. And so it's a lot of things that just have come together. But to tell you what, Shaun, like being an entrepreneur was not on the table. It wasn't something that I didn't know any when I grew up. It wasn't something like people that I knew in my neighborhood didn't start businesses, right? That's not what you did. And so I kind of fell into this backwards. I love it, but it became one of those things that for me, it was and continues to be the best way for me to live life like full tilt and not have to hide parts of myself. And it all sort of comes together and I can do that. Whereas in some of my competing careers, I had to, for lack of better words, hide different aspects of myself to be successful in that career.
Well, I thought what you said earlier about kind of books out there, maybe in the productivity space. And I think of my own experience of trying to find systems to learn how to function in my ever-changing world. And I think you're very right. Books often avoid that messy middle where it gets really complicated and the rubber meets the road. And you'll see a lot of stuff that it's all a lot of ideas and concepts, but they don't really tell you how to do anything. Or somebody will share a bunch of success stories and maybe strategies from the far side of the journey. But people often will avoid that middle part because, gosh darn it, it's hard to communicate in a in a broadly applicable way for the largest possible group of people to apply what you're trying to sell, to apply what you're trying to teach. I'd love to have you talk a little bit about, like in your experience with people who, whether it's just projects at work, things in their personal life, like what are the things that hold us back? Because I feel like people get to a place when they get maybe past 25 and into their 30s and beyond, where they stop dreaming. Life is hard, things are impossible, and so everybody has all this stuff that they would love to do that they never quite get to, they never finish. But what are some of those roadblocks and hindrances that kind of keep people, they're moving forward, but with the things that really matter, they're stuck and they never quite get to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you started there. So in the book, I talk about the air sandwich. And the air sandwich is a visual sort of metaphor. So imagine sort of your priorities, your values, your best life is the top slice of bread, and your day-to-day reality and grind is the bottom slice of bread. For a lot of people, there's a lot of air in between. How they want to live their life, who they want to be, and how they spend their days are a lot different. But that air is actually an illusion. In there are sort of 5 core human challenges, and they are competing priorities, head trash, which head trash is that collection of self-defeating stories, sort of the cultural BS that we pick up, limiting beliefs, so on and so forth, that we adopt. The third would be no realistic plan, all 3 of those words being super important. Fourth would be too few resources. And the 5th are poor team alignment. And by team, I don't just mean your work team, I mean your life team as well. And so what happens is, for some of these projects that I call best work projects, the ones that really are going to change your life and change your work, those 5 challenges come up and keep you from doing it. And so part of the thing, and start finishing is a root cause approach. So I start the book where I'm like, here are the root causes that are keeping you from doing the things that you want to do. And then as we work through those root causes, you can see why things aren't going forward. And in case you want to know, like, what's a good starting place, I always am going to go for head trash and competing priorities, right? Because as you mentioned, when we're younger than 25, a lot of times for many people, maybe they don't have kids and family yet. Maybe they don't have that, what they consider to be their career job. Maybe they don't own a house. Maybe they're not in a long-term relationship. So just our priority set is much smaller, right? We can, whatever, if we're working, then our work can go for whatever fun stuff we want to do, right? And so we just have a lot fewer, it's not that we have a lot fewer priorities. It's just that we don't have these responsibilities that create different priorities and requirements on us. And so, yeah, as those things start to pile up, it can feel harder to change. And what I forgot to say just now is why I focus so much on projects is that finished projects bridge the gap between your current reality and the life you want to live and the work you want to do. And so if you're not able to do certain types of projects, again, best work projects, you're going to stay stuck in your current reality. So that's really what goes on. And a lot of times once we start thinking, okay, what are the projects I need to do to take me from point A to point B, we can get some traction on. Last thing I'll say about this before I actually let you talk here is if it takes time, energy, and attention, it's a project. And so the reason I say that is because all too often when we use the word project, we think work project or economic project, and we leave out the work of our lives. But getting married, getting divorced, having kids, cleaning out the closet of June, going on a vacation, moving, buying a car, like all of those are projects. Because they have starts, beginning, middles, and ends. They require time, energy, and attention. But we don't think of them that way. And they don't get prioritized. They don't get planned. They don't get scheduled. They don't get pushed through. And we remain stuck all too often in the personal parts of our life just because we're trying to find it or we're trying to squeeze it into the leftover cracks of our work.
Well, that's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about next. And that's really the audience that you had in your mind's eye as you were writing the book. Because I think if I talked to my wife and said, honey, I want you to read this book about managing projects, she'd look at me like I had 3 heads. Or I'm thinking of like I've got a son who's 19 and he's a real big creative video animation guy. And Jeremiah, you need to read a book on projects. And yet I think with the way you present this in the book, no matter kind of where you are in life journey or what you do, like you've written something that could be widely applicable. But I know for you, maybe in terms of who you work with at Productive Flourishing, and you had somebody or a group of somebody's in your mind's eye. So who'd you write the book for?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, the kiss of death for authors when they say the book is for everyone, right?
They all do.
They all do. So I'm going to avoid saying that. But really who I had in mind is the broad group of people from the creative class whose livelihood and happiness depends upon them converting ideas into valuable, completed projects in the market space. And so that's a broad class of people. But, we're all creative. That's the thing. So many of us have ideas, no matter whether we're, a sandwich artist at Subway, or whether, we're that author wearing that black beret hat, or whether we're the marketing director. We all have a lot of ideas. So the book is really for people who seem to be walking idea factories and just can't figure out how to put shape and structure and priority around some of those projects, and have finally had enough, because, this sort of mirror book, the mirror sort of side of this book, when you really get into it, is actually stop starting, right? But that's not where I wanted to start with it, right? Is start finishing, because most of us don't need to start more projects. Most of us in the group of people that we're talking about, we don't need more ideas. We don't need more projects to start. We need to take more action and more structured action on the ones we already have, and especially on the best of the ones that we have. And that's what the book helps us do, is work through that.
Well, and I think the big thing that you're providing value with is that you're giving people a framework to think and to operate within. About 10 years of my career journey, I actually ran call centers for some large-scale software companies, and we had systems and frameworks for everything. And when we operated within those frameworks, we could do amazing things. We could hit our stats. We could keep our customers happy. One of the interesting things, when I moved away from that into the publishing space, I was amazed at how few frameworks we had for anything at all that we did. And so maybe part of it is just that my mind works that way, but I love to think in systems and in frameworks. And I would say, like, overall, you divide the book into the 3 parts. You've got part 1, clearing the decks for your best work; part 2, planning your project; part 3, working the plan. But I'm curious, as you've been having people connect with the book, as you've been, say, teaching and sharing on this material, with the average reader's journey with the process, what are the parts that, say, people get most excited about? Because I can see there's parts where people are like, yeah, this is amazing. And then there's other parts where we're like, this sucks. It's the worst thing ever. So what's kind of the happy part of the journey and the challenging part of the journey as people are kind of absorbing and living out the material?
Yeah, well, I'm going to say it depends, but that's not helpful, right? I think a lot of the top-down planners love sort of part 1, and they love parts of part 2. Right. The bottom up folks that just really love getting into the nitty gritty and sort of the, that side of thing, they love part 3 because it's basically choosing to do something that really matters to you, figuring out how to do it, and then dealing with stuff as it comes up. Right. That's kind of the broad structure of the book. And so while I do recommend that for some readers, they walk through the entirety of the book, and the reason I do that is because, again, projects, I mentioned projects being bridges, but they're also mirrors, because these types of projects reveal what's going on in your internal landscape, but they also reveal what your external world really is. And so a lot of us have chosen to do that great new resolution, or we've got that bright, shiny object, or like, we got to do that. And then you sit down and you're like, I can't fit this into my life. Like, this doesn't work, right? Unfortunately, the story we end up telling ourselves, the head trash we end up compounding, is I'm not good enough. I can't figure this out, right? This is not for me. As opposed to just looking at the system being like, I got to change the system. I got to change my schedule. I've got to change what I'm working on. I've got to change something external. And it's not me that's broken. It's the schedule that's broken. It's my reality in a way. So that's a broad arc. I think you may have noticed this, Shaun, like there's a hero's journey in the book. Right. And so
every good book has a hero's journey. That's just reality. You do kind of need that to make the structure work.
And I knew that, having read enough books and being, this is my second book, but I'm an avid reader and editor and things like that. So I knew that had to be in it. So people have told me is like they'll be enjoying it. And then they'll reach this part of the book that's like, oh, that's hard.
I don't want to slay the dragon. No,
I don't want to slay the dragon. Or like they'll get to no-win scenarios in chapter 7, and they're like, okay, that's really what the Guardian has been, and I wasn't ready for that. And so So yeah, I think there have been a few things. Like chapter 3 has been what many people have told me is like been the chapter for them. That's where we talk about slaying dragons. We might go into some of it, but chapter 3 has been a game changer for a lot of people, and chapter 7 has been a game changer for a lot of people. And I find that really interesting because for me, chapter 3 and chapter 7 are revealing some of the bigger challenges that are keeping people from really doing their best work.
Well, and I think in terms of a journey with a resource like this is the parts that we get excited about are going to be the parts that just naturally align with our strengths or abilities, places where we're accomplished, and the places where we are going, oh my gosh, this is just so awful. I feel like that is exposing the areas that are our growth areas, or just places that they're kind of hard, or we haven't quite arrived to a place of competence yet. And so, my encouragement with something like this would be use it as a learning journey where, triple down on your strengths and maximize those sections. And for the places that it's going to take longer and it's harder, be willing to, walk uphill both ways, bare feet in the snow, because it's gosh darn it's hard. But kind of the net gains the win long term. That's going to be the big kind of as success builds success, as we've kind of been talking about. I'd love to have you share maybe a couple of sort of testimonials. You're at a point, the book's been out long enough that I'm guessing you're getting some feedback from readers or people who have been trying to apply what you've been teaching in their own particular situation. So, what has that feedback looked like? How have been people applying the message? And related to that, is there any way that somebody has applied this material that's kind of surprised you? Because I find sometimes readers will take something into a place like, I never would have tried to apply it there, but wow, hats off to you.
Yeah, and I'm going to roll back because I actually want to answer the question. One of the more challenging parts of the book for many people have been chapter 5 and chapter 6. And chapter 5 and chapter 6, those go into the nitty-gritty of project planning and how to chunk, link, and sequence and how to build a roadmap. That has been the one where people are like, oh, I don't want to do that piece. And I understand that those, as I wrote the book, I realized, or at least I projected as to why so few of us go into that space. It's because those were the hardest chapters of the book to write. I enjoyed them, but they are sort of simple concepts that it's hard to apply in the context of a book, largely. And I figured this out 2 or 3 years ago, and it was a sort of game changer for me. I figured out why it was so hard to explain in the written form is because they're actual visual problems. Right. And so trying to explain visual problems linearly, like in writing, is super challenging to do. And so that's why those chapters have more visuals than the rest of the book does, because I couldn't explain them just with words. So that would be where I would say most people find that like, okay, it's not really fun anymore. And those are the places where I think most of us need to grow, because that's where the rubber hits the road. If you can't chunk down your projects and actually make a roadmap, you're inevitably going to end up on that other side where your project is sideways. And so I wanted to make sure to answer that question. As far as testimonials go, like a common theme that people have told me is that the book has finally changed the ways that they've been telling themselves terrible stories about their own capabilities and things. Like I had one person say that I finally am able to start to be more compassionate with myself than just beating myself up about everything that I've been doing. And just changing that ratio a little bit for me is like, if that's all the book did for them, I'm happy with that. Because it turns out if you're constantly working from the perspective of you're uniquely defective, or you just can't get your stuff together, or you're fated to struggle, then that's going to color everything you do. And so that's been a common theme, that people are like, oh, I finally get how much some of this head trash, some of these beliefs around no-win scenarios, and some of these competing priorities are keeping me from really doing what I'm here to do. Another major piece of change for people has been around the 5 projects rule. 5 projects rule, I can be brief here, is like it's no more than 5 active projects per time perspective. And if you want, Shaun, I can go into that more. But what they found is that they just finally realized how much they had overcommitted and what that was costing them. And, in the book, I talk about the fact that once you realize our constraints, it causes some grief and frustration, and you'll thrash against that. You'll push against that. But on the other side of all that, there's a peace, because you can look at what you're doing this month and say, you know what? that's all I can do, but these are the right things of everything that I wanted to do. And so I'm just going to focus on these and learn to let the rest go. That's been huge for people. Last thing that's been huge for people has been the idea of success packs in the book. And the success pack are the yaysayers you build around yourself that are your, advisors, your people who see the world differently, the people who put their hands in the work, and the people who are the beneficiaries of your work. Those are, broadly speaking, the success pack. That's really opened people up to realize, like, wait, I've been stuck with this project because, one, I've been doing it by myself unnecessarily. And two, I don't really know who this project is for. I don't know what they need. I don't know how they're going to be better off. And so I just get stuck because I can make a bunch of stuff, but I don't know what it's going. So I think those three things have been the things that people have said over and over again. It's like, oh, Charlie, that made the difference for me. As far as surprising context, because I was thinking, and I feel that, it shows clearly that I was making sure to include women. I was making sure to include people of color. I was making sure to include people with different levels of ability and different things like that. I haven't had too many surprises about people who are like, hey, I'm using that. But I'm surprised by how frequently parents are using it with their kids. That's what I wanted to happen. But I was like, I don't know to what degree parents are going to be translating this to their kids. But I've gotten quite a few emails where it's like, you know what? This is exactly what I needed for my kids to be able to explain to them what's going on. And because I use so many building block metaphors, especially in chapter 5 and chapter 6, they can teach their kids super quickly using skills that they've already taught their kids. And so I'm really excited about that piece of it.
And in terms of, say, number of projects, you talked about a 5 projects rule. Is there ever a time where you might encourage somebody to say only have 3 projects if they just had some gigantic project that, really was the size of 3 of their average projects? I mean, what would it look like to scale that down process-wise?
Yeah, so the long version of the 5 projects rule is no more than 5 active projects per time perspective, right? And it makes room for that. And I'm just going to slide in here real quick. So remember I said that the project is anything that takes time, energy, and attention. Now, what we often forget is that, again, going through a divorce, that's going to be a project that has all sorts of things that spawn off with it, like taking care of kids, probably moving, maybe getting new jobs, dealing with legal sort of stuff having to do with that. Like that one project is going to spawn off all these other ones. But I'd also want to say that, dealing with grief, like you have someone die in your family and they mean a lot to you or whatever that is, like grieving, you can either think of it, it's a project or it takes away one of your project slots, right? If you've been in a car accident or you've gotten a new chronic illness or you've had to go through surgeries, like all of those things can either be a project or take away from your project slots. So, this case is like if you have been in a car accident, that might be one of those things where all of a sudden you got all these appointments, you got less energy, you got pain, you got all the sort of things. You don't have 5 projects anymore. You got at most 4. And you can either count recovery as a project or just take away your discount. It does the same, or take away the amount that you get. If you're going through that divorce and it's a particularly challenging one with kids and moving, that one divorce may be 3 projects over the course of a year. So you got to look at the other 2 sort of projects of your life. Now, when I talk about projects, I make space for, I'm not talking about every single thing that you're doing. I'm highlighting those more important change-making projects in your life, or those ones that are going to alter your life in different ways. And so technically, yes, taking out the trash is a project, but we don't really need to put that down as that. But, going through school, if you're a student, each one of your courses is a project that has other projects related to it. So, and I'm a huge, huge fan for people to be like, you know what? This is my one thing. And earlier in the book, I talk about 3 levels of success, which is small, moderate, and epic, or extreme if you're not a millennial. I get that, right? And so what we often want is we want sort of epic results from a project, but we're not willing to put in epic effort, right? We're not willing to do that. And as long as we have that mismatch between the amount of effort we're going to put in and the amount of, the results that we want, it can be challenging. So it's one of those things where I'll tell people, it's like, if you're really going to choose one of these projects and just, have an epic goal there, it's probably going to take away from other slots, right? Other sort of projects, because you're going to do the a high amount or the maximal amount of projects that project contains. So for instance, I'll make this more specific. Let's say you're a book author, right? And your epic success, you want to do the bestseller run, you want to be a Wall Street Journal, you want to be on the New York Times. Well, that's great. And that means pretty much every marketing channel that you can use, you're going to use. That means all the different ways you might invest in the exposure and visibility of your book, you're going to need to do that. That means, you don't necessarily you don't get to do 15, 20 podcast interviews and be done with it. Like, you need to be saying, like, I'm going to get to my first 100 in the first amount of time. Like, you have to do everything at that level to get that reward. And so again, that's why I would say if it's a project that you want an epic level of success, you're probably not going to be doing 5 other projects like that. And the other grace that we have by choosing our level of success is, by the way, not everything has to be epic. And that this is something that we can't accept in our sort of American can-do over busy. Is it like you might just decide, you know what, this thing that I want to do, with the broader priorities I have in my life, a small success is great. So maybe I'm not, an award-winning, manager that everyone wants to work with and that I'm making, the company grow and excel. Like, maybe I'm here to like do the job I'm paid to do well, and not toe the line and not just be mediocre, but like, I'm not trying to be that person, right? Because right now my mom is transitioning into elder care. And my priority is making sure that I'm present for that and seeing her through in a way than, getting, another attaboy at work because I'm the best manager that there ever is.
I always find with books that have kind of a framework message or a process message that it's interesting to see how the author has actually applied that message in their own life. And so I'd love to have you share, Charlie, a little bit about what are some of the changes or hurdles you've been able to overcome personally by putting this process into play in your own life?
Yeah, so I'll give a really recent one. And this is back at the end of Q1, I stepped on the scale and it was just not where I wanted to be. And it's obvious. I mean, writing books, they're not great for keeping you in shape. I'm just going to say it, right? You got to really prioritize working out because you sit most of the day. And I also had a medical thing last year. And so I had just picked up my sophomore 20 or whatever that is, right? And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to make losing weight a project, right? And so I figured out what I wanted to do, how much weight I wanted to lose. I made it, I knew I was going on tour this year. And I was like, I don't want to be on TV. I don't want to be on recorded podcast. I don't want all of my photos to be this version of myself who I don't feel is me, right? And it's just so, I knew what my time was. I made it into a project. I built my success pack around that. I hired a nutritionist. I hired a trainer. I got my butt up every 3 times a week, right? So in the book, I talk about focus blocks, which are 90 to 120 minute blocks of time that you use to focus on a project. I typically allocate those for creative projects. But for this period, I was like, you know what? Like getting fit, getting in shape I'm willing to use my focus blocks for that, which is something that I haven't historically been able to do. So I went and worked out in the morning, which I hate doing, right? Because I'm like, I could be writing, I could be doing all this other stuff. But I just went through the exact process of the book, to, lose weight. Anytime I have a new thing in the business, we go through the same thing, like what's the goal, what's the timetable, who are the success pack. And I think if nothing else, like I mentioned success pack being such a powerful thing for people. What it does is it helps us convert how problems into who solutions. How problems into who solutions. So instead of being like, hey, Charlie, how are you going to figure this out? And then I'll spend 6 months Googling and, ferreting out the bad information from the good information, and to be like, who do I know that's done this really well? Who's an expert in that I can reach out to and ask? And sometimes that means I got to pay money. It also, most of the time means that with the network that I've built and the 10-year relationships that I've been in, I can reach out to friends or colleagues that I've helped out in the past, and they'll help me out. But I use that quite frequently. We've had some financial goals this year that we've turned into projects and really worked through, and especially dealing with some of our head trash and competing priorities around that. And so for me, I was talking to a friend about this, Shaun, like, this is the book I wish I would have had 12 years ago. Right. But when you're the author of the book, so much of it is just innate to you, right? That you don't have to think about it. But there's, even still, I'll catch myself and be like, okay, what are my levels of success here? Okay, like, what are my competing priorities? What's my head trash? Who do I need to bring on? And the other piece from the book that people really love is the idea of gates, which are your genius, affinities, talents, expertise, and strengths, and using those at the start of the project to figure out how you're going to leverage those to advance toward a goal, as opposed to like picking some random route that everyone else does and then struggling with it. So I'm doing a way better job of using my gates from the beginning and just owning that, like, there are some things that either are going to be a challenge for me or that I don't like to do, but I can probably use my gates in an indirect way to get it done.
So let's say somebody gets the book, they're starting to read it. What other sorts of tools and resources are going to be helpful for them to maximize the success they have with your material? Because I find oftentimes with a project management scenario or a system, there are a number of other things. Maybe you might need an app, you might need a notebook, but for what you've created, what additional tools and resources are the readers going to want to pull together to maximize their potential for success?
Great. So if you go to startfinishingbook.com/resources, we've compiled a lot of project planning resources, worksheets, things like that. So, at Productive Flourishing, we create planners, worksheets, and tools that help people channel their creativity. And so we curated some of those that our general audience uses, and we created some that are specific to the book. So I would say that would be one of the things I would hope people would check out. A basic task management system, like I pushed Asana as a default. Why Asana is super great, or why these things are super great, is again, going to the blocks that we talked about. I think we can go into overkill in our daily planning sometimes, and that we're listing out everything that we're going to do that day, and it can get overwhelming. But if you can use admin block instead and know that you've got an admin block, which is 30 minutes to an hour, so let's say you have it from 3 to 4, then you can jump over to Asana or your project management thing and just work down the tasks that you put in there and not have to have that cerebral baggage time and time again to do that. Another tool that has been a game changer for people, and they were good partners for the book launch, is Cold Turkey Blocker. And what Cold Turkey Blocker does, I think it's both for PC and Mac. Why I love it is you can schedule it to block both websites and applications at specific times during the day. And so when I'm in heavy drafting and writing mode, I have it block all the distractions until 10 o'clock in the morning. I also, most of the time, not when I'm in book launch, but most of the time I have it shut off. I have it so that at 4:30 in the afternoon, it blocks me out of all social media and all sort of things, because I know that's when my willpower is the weakest. And if I'm not careful, it'll be 4:15 and I'll check Twitter, I'll check Facebook, and next thing I know, it's 6:15 and I've lost that hour of my life, in a click hole. So it just fires off. And because the book talks about people creating good boundaries for themselves and limiting distractions and interruptions, those tools can be really helpful for, one, tools like Asana that help you constructively use those blocks of time, and Cold Turkey Blocker that keeps you from losing them through the normal distractions that, if you're not careful, will eat up that very precious time, energy, and attention that you have.
Well, and you're also a podcaster, so I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't ask about the Productive Flourishing podcast. So tell us about your show and what kinds of content our listeners are going to encounter there.
Hey, thanks for that. So on the Productive Flourishing podcast, we sort of split it up between jams and interviews with authors about their books and things like that. So I'm an avid reader and I love having these types of conversations with authors. But what many of our listeners find to be really valuable is when I actually have a jam with someone where we're either talking about something that's super fascinating to them, but maybe they haven't written it, or it's one of those things where we're talking about their body of work and how their body of work is changing them and challenging them and how they're overcoming those challenges. I personally really like those latter ones because I think so many of us, I think we assume that our heroes, we assume that our inspirations have it all figured out and that they're not having challenges and things like that. And so it humanizes this journey. So they realize, like, oh, Seth Godin is dealing with that too. Or, oh, Dan Pink is dealing with that. right? Malcolm Gladwell, like if we realize that our heroes are just people too, and we realize that the only difference between those people and us is just that they're in the arena and they're making the choices and things, and we're on that same journey, I think it's really powerful for folks.
Well, and almost time for us to wrap up, but I'm always curious to find out, you said you're an avid reader. For you, are there one or two books that you read on an annual basis that it's just such good content that you're coming back to it every year?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I've already mentioned I'm a philosopher, so I don't need to apologize for that. The Tao Te Ching, and there's a version by Skylight Press and Derek Lin that I think is the best of the versions. That's just one that I'm reading probably once a quarter, but I know I'm reading it at least once a year, just going through it and picking up snippets. It's, you didn't ask me to my favorite quotes, but if you ask me favorite quotes, like 2 or 3 would come from that book. So I would definitely say that's one. I make a habit of reading Seth Godin's The Dip. Not necessarily every year, but every few years I'll read it. His program Leap First, also through my publisher Sounds True, is a really good one to listen to as well. So those are ones that I come back to time and time again because they help. And then there are ones that I read once every 3 to 5 years, like The War of Art would be a great one to put on there. Back of the Napkin by Dan Rome is another one, which seems weird that a writer would want to be thinking about visual sort of things, but I learned how to write better by thinking about how to present things visually. It's backwards enough. So there are a few options. Oh, but what I will say, as far as a recommendation, I have 2. It's not what you ask when I'm answering a different question. The Gottman's 8 Dates is a really fantastic book for people who want to have better relationships with people that are just starting out dating, or if you've been in a long-term relationship and you're wanting to reconnect and rekindle. It's just a fantastic book. So I'm super bullish about that. And also The 5 Love Languages. It's another really great book because the reason I focus so much on those 2 is when we look at it at the end of the day, where we tend to find our most happiness is in the relationships, the close relationships we have with our partners and the relationships we have with our friends and family. And learning especially with the love languages, learning the different way people communicate and need love. It's just such a powerful way so that when you are with those people, you're having really quality time with them and living sort of a rich life with them as opposed to just, hanging out with them.
Very helpful. And I'll include links in the show notes to any books that we've mentioned during the episode today. And Charlie, for the listeners who want to connect with you, find out more about your resources, the work you're doing at Productive Flourishing, where can they find you on the web?
So if you're interested in the book, go to startfinishingbook.com. That's all one word, startfinishingbook.com. And if you're interested in the broader body of work that I've been doing at Productive Flourishing, which includes concepts related to start finishing, but also much more in entrepreneurship and leadership, go to productiveflourishing.com.
All right. And again, we'll have all of those linked up in the show notes for you. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Charlie Gilkey. Once again, our book today was Start Finishing, How to Go From Idea to Done. For more on Charlie and the book, a great place to start is startfinishing.com. Again, to go deeper for additional resources and such, head on over to productiveflourishing.com. And Charlie, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Shaun.